when I was in high school, I was kind of at the peak purity culture movement thing there. And so holiness was a really big deal in youth group. And so talking about holiness and living right and all that stuff. And for me, being someone who really wants to get this right and, be the right person, there were times when I thought, wouldn't it be nicer to live under the old law system? Wouldn't it be nicer to, if there's a problem, you just go perform the right, sacrifice and then everything's good? Wouldn't that be nicer? And I could teach on grace, but I clearly didn't understand it very well. And it's interesting because it wasn't until I think Heiser pointed out to me in his podcast that the Old Testament system doesn't actually take care of sin. Sin has always just been something that God forgives. In fact, in Psalm 32, it says, "Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord does not count against them." And I knew that verse, but wait a minute, God not counting against them? What's that all about? Okay, well, check out this next thing. Okay, so over in Hebrews, like chapter 9, okay, we have this first covenant with regulations and worship and this earthly sanctuary thing, all right? And, the priests have their whole system and what they do. But when Christ came as a high priest of the good things that are now already here, what did he do, right? He did not enter into the system by means of blood of goats and calves. Instead, he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, thus obtaining an eternal redemption. The argument is, unlike the old system where you had to constantly be performing these rituals and doing these sacrifices, Jesus just comes in and does it once. Okay? The blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of the heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who, through the eternal Spirit, offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? The argument here is that, you can't actually fix the problem. You can be outwardly cleansed, but your problem doesn't get fixed until Jesus. And this is fascinating too, right? So Jesus is this mediator of a new covenant and all this stuff. But it's also interesting that the author goes on to say, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission, there's no forgiveness, okay, under this old system. There's no forgiveness without blood. But then the very next chapter, just reading on, it says, okay, we've got this shadow system that's coming on, right? Okay, and they were not actually cleansed because they should have been, but they aren't, because these sacrifices are annual reminders of sin. Instead, it's here to tell us, look, you are a sinner. These sacrifices exist to remind you that you need God to forgive you, because it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So this changes the entire structure of everything, because I, with my limited reading of Leviticus, was always like, hey, you just go do the right thing when you've sinned. And the Levitical system doesn't cover any of that. Heiser points out in his long discussion of Leviticus, if you go do that, the Levitical system is when there has been impurity. When something has brought impurity to the camp. There's a great Bible Project video on this as well. And so the sacrifices bring cleansing. They decontaminate you. They decontaminate the space so that you can once again enter into God's presence and do a sacrifice or whatever. But they don't actually deal with sin. In fact, a lot of sins, the only solution is your death, because there's no forgiveness here. There's nothing that takes care of the moral failings that you have. If you go and look through Leviticus, moral failing is not in view, except for if you've done a particularly heinous thing, like raped somebody or killed somebody. There's no solution for you. Death, that's it. Until Christ. Christ comes, brings a new covenant where he also brings forgiveness. And this snaps into focus so many weird things in the Old Testament and early Christian stuff and all this stuff that it's always been like, wait, what's going on here with King David and his hey, God forgive me, and with Bathsheba and killing, her husband and all, there's all this weird stuff when you're reading it and you're expecting well, where's the sacrifice? Where's the thing where it's just going to be made right? Only God can do that. And Jesus is the one who brings that and makes it possible. Okay, that's what I have for today. There's a ton more to discuss with all this, but it's very interesting the more that I learn to realize, okay, my initial early notions as someone who cared deeply about the Bible and studied it were gravely wrong and missing some very important context stuff. So yeah, the Old Testament, the old system doesn't actually take care of sin. It never did. Only God takes care of sin, and that through Jesus Christ.